We continue to watch this monster storm pummel the Florida coast. But tonight, President Trump is holding a campaign rally and fundraiser, trying to raise about $250,000 up in Erie, Pennsylvania, after attending, well, that fundraiser. I'm joined by Susan Del Percio, Republican strategist, Nick Confessori, political reporter at the New York Times, and Jason Johnson. The president knew that people would be commenting on the fact of the split screen. He's not tending to business as chief executive, protecting the homeland, if you will. No, he's raising money, and he's throwing red meat out to the crowd. Why do you think he made the calculation, I'd rather be up there than not?
Because I think he realizes that if he's going to have any time on air, he wants to control it, and he wants the message to be what he has to say. He knows he can't win a battle with a hurricane. He knows that. He's already been cited for being so incompetent, whether it be Maria or other things. He just doesn't even know how to handle it. He has no sympathy. He can't talk about people, real people and what they're going through. And he offers no comfort. So he might as well go to where he can control the message and stir up a little trouble, because that's what this president likes to do.
I agree. I always say he shoots the moon like in Hearts. He always does the opposite of any other normal politician. And somehow it works with his crowd.
I think he's right. Look, this whole idea that you shouldn't campaign in a natural disaster
or raise
money is one of those rules of politics that isn't written down anywhere and doesn't actually matter. His people don't care about it. People in Pennsylvania are not going to be watching a hurricane in Florida, and his party needs him to be out there and get the faithful out, because they are about to lose important races in that state. He's doing the wise thing in a politics terms. It could be the wrong thing in moral terms.
Well, there is one fatality. Let me go to Jason. There has been a fatality already. There'll be more, obviously. I just wonder about geography. I always think about geography these days, politically. Suppose there was some sort of natural disaster hitting New York, and he was down campaigning in Florida. It wouldn't happen, because most people live up in New York. So it wouldn't happen. But it's okay when it's down there and he's up where most people live in the Northeast. I'm thinking he's calculating that, too. He's got to hold the Rust Belt. That's what and Erie's the heart of it.
Yeah, he's got to hold the Rust Belt. And also, as sad as this is and as dangerous as it is, and I must admit, I was comforted by Mayor Gilliam. I mean, he sounded like he had things handled. There's also about expectations. You do have hurricanes that hit the South. You do have hurricanes that hit parts of Georgia and South Carolina and Florida. And so the president saying, hey, look, I'm going to be up here in Pennsylvania campaigning, it isn't strange, because we know that Florida gets hit by things like this. If something like this were to happen in New York, if something like this, if you were having some horrible series of tornadoes or something in Ohio, if it's an unexpected catastrophic weather event, then yes, I think Donald Trump would find a way to be there. But an expected event, even if it's a tragic one in Florida, he doesn't have to be there.
Susan, he bounced all over the place making fun of Obama 4 years ago during the cleanup for Sandy, well into the cleanup era effort. How can he just ignore his own hypocrisy here? I mean, I know.
Well, because
I feel like we're learning how to play with blocks, and we're 3 years old. Like a 3-year-old, we're learning, how does Trump do it? He does it his way, which is obnoxiously counterintuitive, and yet somehow his people just cheer him on.
But what's even worse in this particular case is that Florida's in play right now for Republicans. There's a U.S. Senate race. There's a governor's race. The president, if he was being presidential, could say, I'm helping and providing resources to Florida. Yeah. He could be playing that card, which in Florida, he's not completely upside down in his favorable
He
ratings.
wants Rick Scott to get the credit for being the executive down with his Navy hat on. That's what he wants.
Well, but he could be saying, I'm working with, he could be helping those folks, especially DeSantis right now, who's going to need it very much so after
I think Rick Scott is in much better shape than DeSantis.
But the politics will matter a lot more in the aftermath of this disaster. I think right now he's up in Pennsylvania. What really matters is after the water has gone down, or hasn't gone down, after the wind has stopped, what's the recovery look like? Who is involved there? How effective is it? And that will matter for Gillum, and it will matter for Trump and for Scott.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.